Hello everyone, my name is Cam, and I'm back to talk about another excellent unit in the Ogre Kingdom roster. The Gnoblars. In my opinion, it's going to be your second, maybe even first most important core unit in almost any Ogre Kingdom army. So why do I say that? Well, let's go over some key points with them. They are dirt cheap, coming in at 2.5 points each. They have traps, which cost 25 points and just make them so incredible. I'll go over that in a little bit. And we should also mention their minimum unit size requirement is 10. So yes, that's right, 25 points to deploy a unit in the game that's core. That goes into the next pro for them. You can stall up your deployment phase quite effectively with these guys. As I've already mentioned, I'm a big fan of Ogre Iron Guts, taking a big block of Ogre Iron Guts, and wherever I'm going to put that on the battlefield is probably going to tell my opponent, hey, he's probably going to be focusing in that area and either pushing that way or holding that way. So what I like to do is, before I signal that information to my opponent, I'll deploy as many of these Gnoblar units as I can, so I can hopefully get that information from my opponent before I reveal that information. You know, have him put down his big units that are core, his big investments, see where he plans to move on the battlefield, and yeah, then I can kind of plan on where I want my big ogre bus to go to kind of counter that. Doesn't always work out that way because, again, you are ogres, you typically do have a lowish model count, but these Gnoblars really help balance things out a little bit. They're just so cheap. You should take them in every single ogre list, I promise you. So let's go into the traps real quick. What do they do? If this unit gets charged in the front, everything that charges them, like whatever unit charges them, has to make dangerous terrain tests on all the models in that unit. That is devastating. I think it's a huge reason that in my local meta we don't see a whole lot of hordes. We typically run 20-mans or smaller, more elite units. But yeah, whenever I do see them, I know a lot of people talk about how powerful hordes are in 8th edition, and I'm not trying to deny that, but the thing is, when there's a big horde that, you know, costs 200, 400 points, that's kind of on the lower estimation as well. Depends on what unit and everything we're talking about. Just speaking in generals, but when you have this big horde on the board, it's hard to maneuver, and it's very easy for me as your opponent to get small units like this right up in their face, and then your horde is making dangerous terrain tests on every single model in that unit. And the usefulness of the Gnoblars doesn't end there. It's not like they're just meant to counter hordes. No, like big block of Bretonnian cavalry, put some Gnoblars in front of them. I can't tell you how insulting it is for a Bretonnian knight to fall to a Gnoblar trap. And if that's not enough, they have more stuff to agitate your opponent. They have little bottles and rocks, throwing weapons that they can use. Very close range, very annoying, but it's just another thing to add insult to injury whenever they do get a wound through. It's just another thing to force your opponent into getting that charge off on them, which is what you want, because you want to trigger those traps. Now I'm going to move into weaknesses a little bit later, but we're just going to cover this now. The traps, again, they only work on the front arc. If you get flank charge or you get rear charge, no traps on those units. So you can already see that's kind of a little bit of a weakness. If you have an opponent that can outmaneuver these Gnoblars and get those charges off, it's hopeless for them. So yeah, deployment stall, the traps, just being this agitator. March blocking, there's so many useful things with this dirt cheap unit, just getting in the face of expensive stuff, stalling things up. I mean, just add in addition to, like, most of your units as an ogre player are just so dang expensive. It's nice to have a couple of things like this, where if you lose it, it's really not a big deal. And I really do think that's why this is one of the best trash, throwaway, redirector type units in all of Warhammer Fantasy. So yeah, stalling out deployment. Oh, just another little bonus too. Your ogres don't care if these guys run away, because they're lowly Gnoblars. If anything, an ogre finds that quite hilarious. So that's great. I don't have to worry about chain panic routes or anything like that from one of these units getting deleted on the battlefield. Yeah, I mean, I could really go on and on with the strategic options that having such a cheap unit in such an expensive army presents. You have this big block of Ogre Iron Guts, and there's some kind of combat that they don't want to deal with. You throw these Gnoblars in front. You force your opponent to come to you in the battlefield if you have the range advantage. These guys stall up like a turn or two during that advance. Now your opponent only has like one turn to get that combat in against the unit that he wants to go up against. There's so many uses for this unit. I know a lot of people talk about Saber Tusks, which is another Ogre Kingdom unit, being one of the best kind of throwaway redirector trash units. I believe there was a top 10 Warhammer list units all time. Saber Tusks made that because of those reasons. Many of the reasons these Gnoblars have. But the thing is, the Saber Tusks are special. These are core, which if you're low on core requirement, I don't know, 30, 40 points shy, just add a Gnoblar unit. It's great. The fact that they're core, so they meet those requirements, and the fact that you can stall out deployments with them, it makes them, in my opinion, a little bit better than the Saber Tusks. Now, the Saber Tusks actually have like a good stat line, can win a melee. They have other uses than the Gnoblars, but I don't know. I think at least they can rival each other in terms of just usefulness in an Ogre Kingdom's toolkit. So, yeah, Gnoblars. Just, I cannot understate how powerful these little chumps of a unit are. They seem like chumps, but no, they are the most annoying thing. Your opponent will dread your Gnoblars just as much as they dread your ogres. It's crazy. So, having said how good they are, let's go into just a couple of the weaknesses of them. I will say, you know, the traps are great. Throwing these little bottles, getting all these little poking and prodding attacks are awesome, but once they actually get into the combat and they start swinging, that's when you realize, oh wow, these are, you know, pretty much goblin stat lines, and they're pretty bad. They are almost never going to win a combat. It's more about the stalling features, the traps, the bottles, the march blocking, all the stuff I've already mentioned. It's about those pros. It's not about them actually winning the combats that they get involved in. It's about the damage and delay that they can do before that happens. So yeah, I would say that's fair to mention as a weakness. They're pretty much going to lose any combat that they get in. Like unit of wolves or something charges them, it's probably over. Unless you get really lucky with your traps and stand and shoot and everything. Magic and shooting attacks are a great way to try to clear these things out. So if you have that big board that you invested in, you know, putting a couple of range units on the side, or some kind of like trebuchet, I don't know. Just getting some kind of attack on this unit that will clear it out before your key movement phases are occurring is very, very important. So, you know, it's just one of those things as a ogre player, like you kind of got to play the range game back and forth. Maybe you can stop them from doing it, but I'm going to argue that if he's spending most of his range attacks on those guys instead of your bigger, more valuable units, even that's a win. But I don't know, I'm still including it as a weakness for them. They are obviously extremely vulnerable to ranged attacks and magic, and it is a good way to clear them out. But again, that's like kind of this hidden pro, like when they're soaking up all of that, your ogres aren't. So like you can take that as you will. The already mentioned flank and rear charges on these guys. Obviously they have their bottles for like stand and shooting and stuff too. You can't do that if you get charged in the flank or rear. So it's kind of a double down for them. They're losing their traps, they're losing their throwing attacks and stuff. So you really kind of want to be aware of that. I mean, you know, if your opponent's gonna get the charge off on them, the flank or the rear, like maybe just kind of let it happen too, because like again, like it's such a cheap unit. Like maybe it's just worth kind of tying up whatever it is he's committing towards this, so your ogres can get the actual points during the game. And then this is actually probably the biggest weakness and thing you have to be aware of. Now, most of the time your ogres are going to have a bigger leadership bubble, and that's great. But it is easy to let these Gnoblars get out of your leadership bubbles, and then the moment that happens, you realize, yeah, they've got crappy goblin leadership tests that they have to make, and they are probably going to run. And while your ogres don't care about that, it can kind of throw a wrench in your plan when you have this unit up in front meant to block this big horde, then they fail some panic test from shooting. Well, they're gone now, so the horde is free to move and do whatever it needs to do. So I would recommend trying to keep them in range of your leadership bubble. And then the very, very last thing that I want to mention as a con for these guys is they do have less movement than an ogre. So you really need to kind of deploy them in front of your units, because otherwise you will notice that they are falling behind. In fact, sometimes if you want them to keep their positioning in the unit and you're advancing as the ogre player, you'll notice that your Gnoblars are kind of slowing down your horde. Greasus Goldtooth has a similar kind of effect in an army because he has that slightly less movement for an ogre, and whatever thing you put him in, he's just going to slow down your army. Now again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think ogres have a lot of range capability, and it's pretty easy to force your opponent to come to you. But, you know, it is just kind of something to think about. If you're an aggressive ogre player and you like to move out often and put pressure on your opponent, Gnoblars will kind of slow down that advance if you want them to still be your front line. But yeah, I mean, I think that's fair to say, like, Gnoblars, fantastic unit. I don't have a whole lot else. They are kind of a straightforward thing. There's not a whole lot in terms of options for them. I mean, you could run them bigger, but I personally don't see the point. I would rather have more units with traps instead of increasing their numbers. Yeah, so that's the pros and cons. The last thing I kind of want to go over is some hobby stuff with Gnoblars. It is a super creative option for ogres. Now, Gnoblars are in the ogre army because they're kind of such a lowly, small, skippy little creature that an ogre looks at it and thinks, it's not really an ideal meal. It's not worth the effort, which is rather rare for an ogre to be like, I don't even really feel like eating that thing. It's probably just mostly bones that aren't even that delicious. So yeah, it's kind of why Gnoblars have integrated into ogre society. There are other things and stuff kind of explaining it, but like that's the general reason. But what I like about that is it presents a lot of options for doing proxies and like all kinds of creative little kit bashing. My ogre tribe, for example, is made up of a lot of Gnoblars and night goblins. I mean, I figure they're so similar in stature, you know, like, let's see here, we got like a Gnoblar here, we got a night goblin here. They're so similar in size, like, you know, why not? And the lore kind of for my tribe is this night goblin clan was high up in the mountains in a cavern, probably higher up than they should have been, and when a series of just nasty frostbites kicked in and destroyed most of their cave funguses, they were forced out in starvation and kind of brought into some hostile negotiations with my ogre tribe, which was waiting right outside. And now they serve as the lowest rank in the ogre tribe as our front line throwaway units. But again, too, like, such a fun unit. I mean, like, I have a little Gnoblar riding a boar here. He's like kind of the scout for the unit. He's got his little telescope, so he sits above and like spots out trouble and stuff for the unit, or where they need to get in the face of that enemy over there. Go get in front of him. Yeah, I think that it presents like great creative options. You can pretty much just use goblins and Gnoblars, whatever one you want. They're so similar. The only difference between like a Gnoblar and a night goblin is that the Gnoblar has a slightly bigger nose, I guess. Like, they're really pretty dang similar. And then the last thing, this isn't like a theme for my army. This is like kind of a separate regiment that I did from Nippon. But this like ogre lady, since there are no like Gnoblars over there, she has like a little hamster samurai retainer here in the front that serves as her sword Gnoblar. And again, too, I mean, like, yeah, an ogre probably would snack on that hamster, no problem. But I don't know. I just think it's like kind of a cool idea. Really, any of these little tiny things that are small critters or creatures in Warhammer, you can really justify like them being companions to like a big brutish ogre. I think it's a great combination, you know, like the little adorable thing with the big brute tough guy, like that's great. But yeah, it just like gives you so many creative options. Like I said, I've already had a lot of fun with it. I don't have them here, but like I have like the shaman of the Night Goblin clan and the champion kind of integrated into my Gnoblar units, just to like add little flares of story and stuff. So yeah, that's about it. That's all I got to say on the hobby advice. Be creative with your Gnoblars. You can do really anything that's small and looks like something an ogre might not want to snack on because it's not worth the effort. Or you can just use actual Gnoblars. Do whatever you want. Yeah, that's about it, folks. Thanks for watching, and have a fantastic day. Bye-bye.